When we think about the fall of the Roman Empire, we tend to think that it was inevitable, that all human-made empires have an expiration date, and that every empire, no matter how stable it is, has to fall at some point. We think that the Roman Empire had become old, corrupt, weak, and had to fall sooner or later. But to the contemporaries, the fall of the empire was never a given, and in fact many Romans thought even as late as the 5th century that the troubles of the empire would pass again. Had the empire not already seen very bad times and had survived? Had the empire not withstood barbarian invasions before, during the crisis of the 3rd century, and had survived? Alemanni and Goths had invaded the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century and had destroyed many cities in northern Italy in the late 250s AD and later again in the early 270s. Had these attackers not been repelled by Gallienus at the Battle of Mediolanum in 259 and by Aurelian in 271 AD? Had the empire not suffered a humiliating defeat against the Persians, where Emperor Valerian himself was taken captive by the Persian king in 260? Had the empire not fractured before into 3 separate entities, with the Gallic Empire declaring independence from Rome in 260 AD, and with the Palmyrene Empire following in 270? Had not, as a result of this huge crisis, even the Roman trade network broken down in many parts, causing also huge economic trouble and rampant inflation? And yet, the Roman Empire had prevailed and survived these very dark times, thanks to heroes such as Aurelian. So why should the empire fall now in the 5th century? Who was to say that this wouldn't be remembered as the crisis of the 5th century, and that the Roman Empire would withstand these turbulent and chaotic times? So let us now examine the times where the Roman Empire could have been saved had the right people been in charge at the right time, or if history would have diverged for whatever reason from the path it took in our timeline. 1. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. The Battle of Adrianople is often seen as the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire, as this defeat for the Romans would set a chain reaction into motion that would culminate in large migrations and Germanic people settling within the borders of the Western Roman Empire. This would in turn erode the tax base of the Western Roman Empire that had the poorer provinces as compared to the East, and was geographically more exposed to barbarian threats than the East. In addition, this would create constant conflict within the territory of the empire, ultimately leading to its fall in the time between 476 AD and 486 AD, from the deposition of the last emperor Romulus Augustus in 476 to the fall of the kingdom of Soissons in 486. But it all began with the Battle of Adrianople. The Goths, a Germanic tribe, had fled from the advancing Huns, a brutal Asian tribe of horseback riders who were pushing to the west, originating somewhere in Asia. The Goths had crossed the Danube River in 376 AD and were requesting asylum in the Roman Empire. Due to mismanagement of the situation, which must certainly be the topic of its own video, the situation deteriorated rapidly, which led to open conflict between the Goths and the Romans. This culminated in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. Valens, the Eastern Roman Emperor, decided against the council of his officers not to wait for reinforcements from the Western Roman Emperor Gratian. Current historians estimate the strength of the Eastern Roman forces at around 15,000 troops, 10,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, and the Gothic forces at an equal number of also around 15,000 troops. Due to some tactical errors, the Roman army was defeated decisively, which resulted in uncountable losses. Only a third of the Roman army managed to retreat. And now, since the Eastern Roman army's core had been crippled, it was unable to fully defeat the Goths, and so the Eastern Romans had to allow them to settle within Roman lands. They would become a distinct entity within the borders of the empire, sometimes acting as foederati, but sometimes acting independently or even hostile to Rome, which would ultimately culminate in the sack of Rome by Visigothic forces in 410 AD, further weakening the Western Empire and binding a lot of the Western Roman forces into conflicts that would have been strongly needed at the Rhine frontier. Had Valens waited for Gratian, the Romans would have had very good chances of winning this battle, and history would have taken an entirely different path. The Goths might have been reduced to foederati status early on, and would have never become a distinct entity within the empire. Thus, the Western Roman troops would not have been engaged in many battles with the Visigoths, but would have instead been able to concentrate on the Rhine border and possibly even prevent the crossing of the Rhine in 406 AD. In this timeline, the Western Roman Empire might have stabilized, and the Germanic tribes would have not invaded the empire, but instead they might have been settled at the borders of the empire as foederati forces. The Western Empire thus could have survived for a few hundred more years, or maybe even until the present day in some form. 2. The Battle of the Frigidos River in 394 AD. One of the single biggest disasters for the Western Roman Empire that is often being overlooked is the Battle of the Frigidos River. In this conflict, the Western Roman usurper to the throne, Eugenius, and his Magister Militum Arbogast were pitted against the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius and his Magister Militum Flavius Stilicho. The rise to power of Eugenius and Arbogast shall be the topic for another video. It is especially interesting since this was the last time that the old pagan temples of Rome were allowed to be open, and we would have witnessed the old pagan rites performed in Rome for the last time. Theodosius, however, did not recognize Eugenius as the rightful emperor of the West, and intended to make his son Honorius Western emperor. He marched against Eugenius and Arbogast, and the two opposing armies met at the Frigidos River on the 5th of September 394 AD. This battle again deserves an entire video of itself. Both armies had a size of around 50,000 troops, and the battle first started well for Eugenius and Arbogast. But then, on the second day, the situation changed completely when suddenly a strong wind blew into the faces of the Western Roman forces, giving the Eastern Romans the upper hand. The Western Romans were then utterly defeated. Eugenius was captured and beheaded, and Arbogast committed suicide. The aftermath was a complete disaster for the Western Roman military. Almost all of Western Rome's legions were destroyed, so that the new Magister Militum of the West, Flavius Stilicho, had to recruit more and more barbarian mercenaries as foederati into the legions. This would create immense problems later on, as the percentage of foederati would increase to such a point that Roman troops would become the minority. These foederati would then often have agendas contrary to the empire, and in the very last years of the Western Empire, barbarian chieftains would wreak havoc in the weakened empire, further accelerating the fall. So the Battle of the Frigidos River is a momentous event, and had it been averted, for example by Theodosius accepting Eugenius as Western Emperor, the Western Roman Empire would not have had to rely so much on barbarian forces later on. This in turn would have meant a stronger Western Roman military, potentially being able to withstand the crossing of the Rhine in 406 AD. The Western Roman Empire might in this case have survived far longer than it did in our timeline. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any future videos about the history of the late Roman Empire. Gratias ago tibi, amici. 3. The crossing of the Rhine in 406 AD. Another momentous event in the history of the late Western Roman Empire was the crossing of the river Rhine on December 31st of the year 406 AD by Germanic tribes, although this exact date is still debated among historians. A large group of Quadi, Vandals, Sarmatians, Saxons, Burgundians, Alemanni, and a few more tribes crossed in large numbers into Western Roman territory and started plundering many cities in the province of Gallia in the following years. The Magister Militum Stiliko was unable to stop them, since he had to fight barbarian invasions in Italy. First, he defeated the Visigoths at Pollentia and Verona in 402, and then he defeated a large incursion by the Vandals and Goths under Radagaisus in 406 at Faesulae. It is believed that he withdrew many Roman troops from the Rhine region in order to be able to win against the invasions of Italy. The barbarian invasions into Roman Gaul and later Hispania were a black stain on Stiliko's career that many contemporaries held against him. But what if Stiliko would have chosen a more balanced approach for the defense of Italy? It is debatable if he would have had enough troops to fight off the Vandals and the Goths and at the same time defend the Rhine frontier. But had the Rhine frontier been fortified well enough by some means, the crossing of the Rhine on that fateful year might have been averted. An organized Roman resistance at the frontier would have prevented the Germanic tribes of entering Gallia, and this would have stopped the cascade effect that would later lead to the Vandals conquering Africa, and the Suebi and Visigoths creating their separate kingdoms in Hispania. But as I said, it is debatable if Stiliko would have been able to achieve this with the troops he had. Personally, I think that the Western Roman Empire would have bitterly needed the legions that were destroyed during the Battle of the Frigidos River in 394 AD, in order to be able to avert the crossing of the Rhine in 406. 4. The murder of Flavius Stilicho in 408 AD. If there is one event where we can say that things really started to unravel fast for the Western Empire, it is the execution of the Western Roman Magister Militum, the commander of the Western field armies, Flavius Stilicho in 408 AD. Honorius, the son of Theodosius, had been made emperor of the West shortly before the Battle of the Frigidos River, and with the victory of Theodosius over Eugenius and Arbogast, nothing stood in the way of Honorius becoming emperor. Unfortunately though, Honorius proved to be a weak and incapable emperor, and in my opinion ranks amongst the worst Roman emperors of all time. In 408, the Visigoths attempted to invade Italy again, after they had been defeated by Stilicho in 402. This time, Stilicho convinced the Roman Senate to pay 4,000 pounds of gold in order to persuade the Goths to leave Italy. The powerful minister Olympius, meanwhile, at the imperial court in Ravenna, convinced Honorius that Stilicho was conspiring with the Visigoths to overthrow the emperor. Upon Stilicho's return to Ravenna, he was executed. But not only him, no, Honorius had also ordered the execution of Eucherius, Stilicho's son, and of other key individuals who held office under Stilicho's command. This purge also targeted the families of Stilicho's foederati troops, resulting them to defect in large numbers over to Alaric's Visigoths. Thus, Honorius not only had killed the Western Roman Empire's strongest defender, but he had thus even increased the strength of the Visigoths. And indeed, 2 years later, the Visigoths would go this time unchecked into Italy, for there was no Stilicho anymore to prevent this from happening. and they would sack the city of Rome itself in 410 AD, the city that had not been sacked for 800 years. This would be a great shock for the empire among contemporaries. After the sack of Rome, the Visigoths would establish their own independent kingdom in Hispania. These disasters could have been averted if Honorius would have been a more able emperor, or if Olympius would not have exerted such a great influence over him. If Honorius had not executed Stilicho, his son and officers, history would most likely look very different. Stilicho would have kept the Visigoths in check and would have recruited new troops from the province of Illyricum. He might have later on successfully defeated the invading Germanic tribes in Gaul and Spain, thus stabilizing the empire in a critical time. The sack of Rome would also not have happened, therefore not devastating the morale of the Roman population. All in all, if Stilicho had lived, the events of the 5th century would have gone a very different path, and the Western Roman Empire might thus have survived far longer than it did in our timeline. 5. The Vandals conquering Africa in 429 to 439 AD. After the execution of Stilicho, the very able commander Constantius III managed to stabilize the Western Roman Empire somewhat. He achieved the rank of Magister Militum in 411, quelled the rebellion of Constantine III, and waged war against the Visigoths, defeating them in 416. He then defeated various other Germanic tribes, regaining control of much of Hispania and Gallia by 420. Unfortunately though, he died already in 421. Later, the also very able Flavius Aetius would rise to power, becoming Magister Militum of the West in 429. Unfortunately though, other powerful military commanders were entrenched in a power struggle with Aetius. This was for one Flavius Felix, the Magister Utriusque Militae of Italy, and the other one was Bonifatius, a general and governor in the province of Africa. Felix accused Bonifatius of wanting to create his own kingdom in Roman Africa. Thus, Felix sent his Gothic foederati in order to overthrow Bonifatius. Thus, as so often, Romans were fighting Romans while the barbarians were knocking at the gates, a very typical picture in these times, where civil war was the rule, not the exception. The Vandals saw this power struggle and decided to cross from Spain to Africa in 429 with their entire 80,000 strong population. Meanwhile, Aetius had sided with Bonifatius, and some think that it was on Aetius's orders that Felix was murdered in 430 AD. In the following years, Bonifatius tried defending Africa against the Vandals, but without success. The Vandals were advancing. To make matters worse, now hostilities broke out between Bonifatius and Aetius, and Bonifatius left Africa in order to fight Aetius. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Rimini in 432, leaving only Aetius as the sole Magister Militum. This civil war between Felix, Bonifatius and Aetius had not only destabilized the empire and again drained it of vital troops needed to fend off the Germanic invaders, but it had effectively left Africa unprotected and allowed the Vandals to conquer that vital Roman province. By 439, even Carthage had fallen to the Vandals, where they now had established their own kingdom. Without the grain supply from Africa, Rome could not sustain its population and began falling into decline. Several attempts to reconquer Africa later would fail. Thus, the invasion of Africa was a major factor in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and this is a black stain on Aetius' career. Many historians see him in a critical light because of his failing to prevent that disastrous event from happening. However, it should be noted that during that time, he defeated the Visigoths in southern Gaul and re-established Roman rule in the province of Raetia by defeating the Jutungi in that region. And he also defeated the Burgundians in 436, resettling them and severely reducing the size of their kingdom. Yet still, had Aetius chosen to send Bonifatius reinforcements, or to go to Africa himself in order to fight against the Vandals, the invasion of Africa might have been averted. With Africa remaining under Roman rule, the grain supply to Rome would have continued. Thus, Rome would not have diminished in the 5th century as it did in our timeline. The additional tax income from that rich province would have allowed Rome to continue recruiting new troops, and the Western Roman Empire might have managed to stabilize. Without Vandal raids harassing the empire, the Roman troops would have been able to assure the Germanic tribes foederati status for decades to come, thus preventing the Germanic invaders to form their own kingdoms on Roman territory. In this timeline, the Western Roman Empire would have had much better chances of surviving well until after 476 AD. We can see that the fall of the Western Roman Empire was indeed not set in stone, but from 378 to 429 there would have been quite a few chances to avert the fall, or at least to postpone it until a much later time. In the next video, we are going to look at 5 other momentous events in late Roman history where the empire might have been saved until as late as the mid-7th century. Thank you for watching, friends of Roman history, and bene vale amici.